Hi, this is Eliza Inkberry with Darkside University's Gothic gardening class, and I'm doing a Gothic Three Sisters um, video here. So, if you're not familiar, the Three Sisters are a traditional Native American planting that people do, and it's kind of we've kind of abbreviated it. We took this from the milpa, which I'll talk about in a moment, but these are some examples of what people are doing, and most of the time. The Western world does kind of a corn, beans, and squash combination, and they can use any kind of squashes. Traditionally, it was more of a pumpkin type of squash, like a winter squash. They were all three storage crops. So you'd be able to store the dry beans and store the dry corn and store the thick-skinned winter squash. And winter squash grows in the summer, but you store it through the winter due to the thick skin on it. So just think pumpkin and you'll have a pretty good idea. Butternut squash, things like that. So these are all different examples, and traditionally, the corn becomes the trellis for the beans. The corn's planted just a little bit before the beans, so it has time to kind of outgrow the beans and doesn't get smothered by them. And then the squash is put in, and it shades the soil under the plants and holds in the moisture better. And so they all three work together well. The beans also fix nitrogen, which the squash and the corn also benefit from. And so it's a good combination of crops that are more productive when grown together in the amount of harvest you get from the same space. I'm not sure what's happening here because traditionally the point is not to have to use a trellis, but they may be just doing something that they consider more ornamental. But I decided to come up with a way for this to be more of a Gothic themed garden element. It's also kind of what guilds in permaculture are. I don't know if they're based on it, but they are similar concepts where you have plants that work together in the same space. This is an article by Toby Hemingway on the fourth sister, which was Cleome, which is a flower. It's called spider flower and cat's whiskers, and then there's also some other crops that sometimes people use. But this is a really interesting article about that. If you want to check it out, just go to the website. Address is up here. And this is about milpas, which is just a word for field. And there's a lot of different plants that were grown in a milpa. And a lot of times they'd have as much as a dozen crops or more in the same space instead of just three. But they would grow things like melons, tomatoes, tomatillos. There's actually one called purple de milpa. Um, Sweet potatoes are a big one. Jicama, it looks a lot like a kudzu plant, but then the root is edible and it's nice and crunchy, like I'm trying to think, like an apple, but it kind of tastes like a bean. It's really delicious. A lot of different crops that you could grow if you don't want to grow the traditional Three Sisters, but Three Sisters is a good way to get started in guild planting. This is on Slash and Char, which is how traditionally milpas were started. You would take a low oxygen pyrolysis burning method, or more like smoldering method, and it would make high quality charcoal instead of ash. And the charcoal has a very large surface area, and if you look into that, you can look up things like cation exchange capacity. It's basically the ability of the charcoal to hold on to a lot of nutrients in the soil, and it also provides this enormous amount of surface area for beneficial microbes to live in your soil food web, and it's kind of permanent, whereas most soil additives are not. Organic matter is going to burn off in a short period of time and needs to be constantly replenished each year. But the biochar will last for a very long time, and they have soils like in the Amazon that are heavily slash and char biochar, or they grew out of community fire pit waste dumps that had a lot of charcoal, and the fertility in them is extremely high even today, thousands of years later. So that's something you can look into. And if you really want to learn about biochar, I actually attended this workshop, and you might see me in the video, but these 5 videos on Living Web Farms website. They have a lot of really good workshops you can watch, and this one's really good on learning how to do biochar at home. This system here is actually a large scale system, but they also showed how to do much smaller ones, and they talked about why biochar is useful. There's some debate on what it actually does, but there's not a whole lot of dispute that it does improve the soil a lot. So that's something that you might want to look into about making your own small milpa, or you could just buy some bags of biochar and put them in the one bed you're doing for your 3 sisters. And this is the milpa cycle. So you start with a forest. And usually at this point it's not very productive to humans. The trees are getting old and they're starting to rot, and the understory trees are struggling because there's no light, because the canopy is really dense, and so the wildlife isn't even getting a lot out of it at that point, because the berries and stuff on the forest floor can't get any light, and the older trees are getting sick. And so the elders in the community would decide which areas of forest could be slashed and charred to make a fertile milpa field to grow the crops. And so they would go through the process and start growing the milpa, and they might grow it for a few seasons, but they didn't want to abuse the soil and overuse it so that it became sick. So once they had grown the milpa a few times, they would actually replant the forest and put back in trees that would be good overstory trees, and then they put in plants that would be good understory plants, or they would just select, like, those plants are going to come up anyway, because you always have kind of succession pioneer species that come up in a blank area. Nature does not like a hole, and it will fill it in. And so they would come through and they'd identify what plants were there, and they might prune and weed and select the ones that they wanted the most, and they would space them well so that each one got enough sun to produce well. And then you would get these young highly productive forests, and they would start to grow up into the large forest again. And this was a process that lasted, a long time, decades. And so that was really important to have elders in your community that remembered where you planted things. And so you would have a slightly migratory system where you traveled around to your milpas to collect your winter storage stuff, or your greens, or whatever you happen to be growing there. And you would have forest crops, mushrooms, and you would have tree nuts and things like that as well. And so this is, and actually I wanted to show you, in addition to the crops that we looked at over here, here's another list that has some different crops. So beans, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, sunflowers are one. So if you wanted to switch your corn for sunflowers because you're not really interested in growing corn, you can do that, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And so some people are kind of adapting these. Ground nuts are a native plant to the southeast that makes a really good tuber, and so it's also a nitrogen fixer. So that's one that people are switching out for that. So we go back to this, and this is an option for a goth 3 sisters garden. So you could do a black corn. This one's a flower corn, and a lot of times these get called blue corns too, and you've had probably blue corn chips and things like that. So it makes a blackish blue cornmeal. And so if you're not interested in grinding cornmeal, you might want a different corn. This one can be used for multi-use. It's called Bloody Butcher, and it's a nice deep red. And you can use it for a lot of things. You can make flour cornmeal, or you can use it as corn on the cob when it's not fully mature and it's still got kind of the sweet kernel taste, but it's still not going to be like the super sweet corns that Americans at least are used to. So if you really want that traditional, well, not traditional, but it's more recent that we've bred them to be this sweet. But if you'd like that, you can get some of the modern hybrids, like Ruby Queen is a red variety that would work. And this one's one you can't save seeds from. You'd have to buy the seeds every year, but it does have that supermarket really, really sweet corn taste. You could also do a popcorn. This is strawberry popcorn uh, corn, and it's got a much smaller ear, and the kernels are pretty small, but it's a really pretty red corn. And here's another sweet corn that's more like the Bloody Butcher than it is the Ruby Queen, but and then there's some other white ones. So if you wanted to do like a white moon gardeny looking white corn, you could do that too. And so then we get on to the beans. So you're going to plant your corn first, and then you're going to wait until I think you wait until it's about 8 inches tall, and then you put your beans in underneath it, and they start to climb up the corn. And this is a good one if you wanted black beans, because you want to pick a pole bean. The bush beans are not going to climb the corn the way the system is set up for. So pick a pole bean. Any pole bean will do, and but you do want to pick them in this Phaseolus vulgaris, because a lot of the other types of beans are a little bit too vigorous. Like I wouldn't grow a yard-long bean or a hyacinth bean on corn in a Three Sisters situation, just because they are so vigorous and they might totally smother the corn and keep it from getting enough sunlight. So the P. vulgaris varieties of beans are better. And this includes your soup beans and your snap beans that most people are used to at the supermarket. So when you see green beans, or you see a lot of the other kind of black beans and stuff, this is what you're buying, or what species it originally came from. But you can read about the Cherokee Trail of Tears bean and the history behind that. That's a saved seed, and it makes a good black bean. I like Triunfo Violetto. I will say that it's not the best for the southeast heat. Some of this is also a P. vulgaris, and some of these are not as good with heat as others. But this one is a really pretty dark purple bean, and I really like the Seeds from Italy company because they give you such huge seed packets for the price. So a lot of companies now charge like $3 a pack, but then you're only going to get a small amount of seeds. They send me more seeds than I can use every year, so I end up giving some away. And this is rattlesnake pole bean, and this is what the dried beans will look like if you're going to save the beans. And it's a dual use bean. Like the Triunfo Violetto, you could use it as a dual use bean, but it's primarily a green bean. People eat it the way they do snap beans, and this one can be a snap bean or a soup bean. And by soup, I also include things like chili in that, whatever you like to make with your dried beans. And this is what the pods on that rattlesnake bean look like. And that's a good pole bean variety that does well in the heat. And then you're going to move on to your squash. And squashes for Three Sisters are usually more of the rambling types than they are the bush types. But you could use the bush types, especially if you're low on space, because they're still going to shade the ground. But in a milpa system, when you have a big field, they would use the rambling ones that kind of keep crawling in between all the plants and fill up the field as a living mulch. And mostly they're using the winter squashes for that. And this one's pretty awesome, kind of black, warty squash. And if you cut that open, it's going to have a nice sweet flesh like a butternut. I like Cucurbita machata species for squash varieties because they are pretty much immune to squash vine borer. And in my experience, they outgrow powdery mildew. Even if they get it, they keep growing, and they touch the ground, and they put down new roots, and they go and go and go. And I end up with a pretty good harvest from C. machata in my area. But you may not even have squash vine borers where you live, so that may not be a consideration you need to take. So you could definitely use whatever kind of squash you prefer. You can use crooknecks, you can use zucchinis, all of those are types of squash. And this is another machata winter squash that I think is really cool looking, and these store so well. Like you'll still have them when you're planting the seeds from them the following year. They won't go bad if they don't have any holes in the in the skins to let in pathogens, they're going to keep really well for you. And so here's Cucurbita machata. I just included the Wikipedia article on it. It lists some of the varieties. I really like Long Island cheese. I think I've mentioned it before. It's a nice, pretty Cinderella-looking fairy tale pumpkin. And you can eat any of these, like the butternuts and even the pumpkins. If you pick them when they're young and green and still kind of soft and easy to dent with your fingernail, that's an indicator for them being good to eat as a squash. Like a summer squash. So you can eat them like they're a zucchini at that stage. And Tromboncino, that's listed right here, is kind of the best one that of Cucurbita machata bred for that, because it was specifically bred to be eaten as a zucchini. And here's a whole bunch of different types of squashes. I didn't want to only do the machatas, so you have a lot of options. You have this crazy looking one. There's a lot of really cool squashes. I love heirloom squashes. They tend to be prolific and fascinating and have great flavor. So much different than what you just find in the regular supermarkets these days. And so here's the fourth sister that Toby Hemingway was mentioning, and it's the Cleome, also called spider flower, cat's whiskers, spider wisp. And I found this violet one, which is really pretty. I've actually grown it before, and I always grow this white one because I have seeds that I save from it every year. And so those would be good goth options in a Three Sisters that has kind of a dark flair to it. But this one is for attracting beneficial insects, and Cleome in particular is good at attracting the type of insects that will pollinate beans and squash. Corn is wind pollinated, so it does not actually need you to attract beneficial insects for that. But if you're doing sunflowers instead of corn, the sunflowers themselves will attract beneficial insects, and then the Cleomes will help. And this is a website. I like Swallowtail Garden Seeds. I've ordered from them a lot, and they have a lot of different options here. So if you wanted something that was closer to red, and they have a lot of different Cleome varieties here. I wonder, and then the variety that was traditionally used is this Cleome cerulata, and it's also a known edible plant. I'm not sure about the other Cleome's edibility. There may be edibility in a lot of them. They're kind of related to brassicas, which is like cabbage and broccoli and things like that. But this one definitely has some edibility, and I haven't tried to grow this one yet because sometimes the plants that grow in like dry areas don't do well where it's hot and humid. But I'm thinking about giving this one a try just to see if it's one that will do well here. Sometimes they surprise me. But this is an option for buying these if you want to get the original Western native plants. And here's an article on Eat the Weeds, which is a website I just love. He and Samuel Thayer are my favorite forager authorities. And so I like reading about how you can eat Cleome if you're interested in eating them instead of just having them as a beneficial insect plant. And here we have the Legend of the Three Sisters, and this was recorded a while back. And so if you want to read the legend, the Native American legend that goes along with the Three Sisters planting, which helps people remember this is how you pass down information of this sort, to know that if you combine corn and beans and squash and so on, that they are going to grow well together. Is you have these legends that go with it that represent all the members of that plant guild. And so if you want to check this out on the Cornell blogs, it's a really fun story. And that's all for Gothic Three Sisters gardening. So I hope you give it a try and maybe let us know how it goes.